Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll go back in history a little bit about humans and computers. I remember well in the mid-80s and then in the early mid-90s there was a lot of debate in scientific circles as well as in chess circles. Will computers ever defeat humans? And the group of people have been very divided. Some believed never ever, while others thought it's only a matter of time. Among the ones who doubted early on that the computers will ever defeat the best human chess players were Garry Kasparov. However, then later, in the mid-1990s, he has played several matches that were greatly followed around the world, much beyond just the chess circles. The match he played in 1996 against Deep Blue in Philadelphia, he still succeeded to win. And I'd like to share in this lesson a game from that match. It will greatly demonstrate the weakness of the computers. I'd like to mention though that Deep Blue of IBM came back a year later in 1997 and won the famous match against Garry Kasparov, and since then the debate pretty much has been resolved. The computers seem to be better than humans, and I think humans just tend to accept that and rather use the computer as an assistant, as an aid in their own preparations against other humans. I read an interesting statement by Frederick Friedel, who is one of the early experts in computer chess, and he said that there are about 20% of chess positions that computers don't understand, and humans understand much better. There are about another 20% of positions that no matter what, computers are just much better than humans. They'll win every single time. And then there are those other 60% of the positions when the two sides, obviously the computer not knowingly, but human possibly knowingly, is trying to steer the position in the direction of the 20% of the type of position that favors each side. He also said that over the years these percentages may change and there will be more positions favoring the computers. However, there will always be some percentage, whether it's 5 or 10, we don't know, in which humans will be better than computers. And that's exactly the type of position that Kasparov succeeded to get the game into in the game that we're about to see. Okay, let's see how the game developed. Okay, so the game started with knight f3, d5, d4, c6, c4, e6, and here Garry Kasparov chose the rare move knight b to d2 instead of the knight c3 or e3, which are more popular. Came knight f6 and e3. And in this position, interestingly, it's considered perhaps the best choice for black to play c5, even though the c-pawn already moved once earlier. But nevertheless, because of the less active positioning of the white knight on d2 compared to c3, black can afford that and it is fine. Kasparov here continued with b3, came knight c6, bishop b2, pawn captured, and came bishop e7. Rook c1, castle, bishop d3. This is a standard setup that's pretty common in the Cole opening, And here black chose the wrong plan. Black just simply, the computer, Deep Blue, played very passively and without any clear plan. Bishop d7 is one of those moves that develops the bishop, but not necessarily to a better place than it was. I believe it would be a better idea to try to develop the bishop to b7, although at this moment it was not necessarily a good choice, because the knight on c6 would remain on an unprotected square. So black played inaccurate already earlier in playing simply the natural moves, and when you waste a move of tempo by moving the same pawn twice, you typically cannot afford just making regular moves. You need to play more precisely. In any rate, without getting much involved in the opening part of the game, I'd like to focus in the middle game and in the way Kasparov played took advantage of the computer's errors. And here comes the first one. When black plays knight h5, it's kind of an awkward move, even though the knight aims to get to f4, but in reality the knight doesn't achieve much there. White simply played rook e1, knight f4, and the bishop just retreats to b1. The problem is that the knight is alone on f4 without any other piece helping the attack. And as we shall see, the knight will be chased back, and then on g6 we can see has no potential. All of these squares are covered by white pawns, and therefore the knight can only go back to e7, which of course doesn't promise much either. And this was the moment when Kasparov played knight e5, centralizing the knight. Certainly a good choice. Rook c8, and simply captured the bishop, making sure that just in case those diagonals open, black will not be able to take advantage of the somewhat weakened light squares around the white king. Of course, now that the black bishop of light squares is gone, that's no longer a worry. Queen d7, knight f3, here comes the second knight. Bishop b4 attacks the rook, but in reality it doesn't really do much. Rook simply went away, and came rook f to d8. And now the question is what to do next. Well, one of my favorite type of moves, h4 in this position, is a good idea, with ideas of playing h5 and even h6 if black allows it. But black decided to run before that would happen, and now white simply gains a lot of space on the other side of the board. Look at this. a3 attacks the bishop, bishop returns, and b4, bishop c7, and c5. With these 4 consecutive pawn moves, white gained great advantage in space on the queen side of the board. One of the big problems that black has in this game and in this position is that they don't have a plan, and that's partly because white doesn't have any weaknesses. And if the opponent has no weaknesses, that makes it much more difficult to create a plan. In fact, the black pieces are very passive and greatly limited in their mobility. In the meantime, white has a pleasant choice of plans, whether to further advance on the queen side or try to develop an attack on the other side of the board. As black doesn't have many pieces on the king side, I believe that's a reasonable plan as well. Black continued with rook e8, and white played queen d3, a smart move provoking further weakening of the king side. And black responded by playing g6 and game rook e2, getting away of the knight f5 attack in advance, and now bishop c3. Now we can already see that white is preparing further advance on the queen side. It's gonna be pretty incredible, the picture we'll see in just a few more moves, how the black pieces will completely get paralyzed on the queen side of the board. So after bishop c3, black played h5, preventing white playing that sometime in the future. Because another plan, if black would not play h5, would be to play king g2 and then h5, rook h1 and attack there. But now black has chosen the plan for white, and white was ready to play b5. This move doesn't just chase the knight away, but creates a phalanx of pawns that simply suffocate black's position. So after b5, the knight moved, and now white played bishop to d2, with ideas of relocating the bishop to g5 to cause harm along the dark squares around the black king. Came king g7, and now white is ready to advance further, a4. Rook a8 and a5. We can see that white has a free hand on the queen side of the board, and black has still no counterplay whatsoever. Came a6 in hopes that white would trade. Of course, white doesn't, but played b6, attacking the bishop. And now the problem is that if the bishop goes to d8, then the white dark squared bishop will appear on f4 and then on e5. On the other hand, when the bishop moved to b8, we can see the horrible future of the black rook on a8 as well as of that very bishop on b8. We can see that bishop does not even have a potential to get out of there, and that means that the black rook is stuck in the corner. White continued with improving the position of the bishop, bishop c2, knight c6 and bishop a4. Now that the knight is pinned, black is even more restricted than before. Rook e7 and bishop c3. A tricky move that on one hand prevents any hopes of dreams of playing e5 for black, but also supports a potential white knight jump to e5. And here black tried something tactical, but in reality this only speeds up the end. Black played knight e5. It's a discovered attack, so if now white captures black's queen, then the black knight captures the white queen, and at least black is still in the game. But white did better by capturing the knight and allowing queen a4, and now knight d4. Sadly for black, nothing changed. The rook is still stuck in the corner, and the bishop on b8 still doesn't have any hopes of ever getting out of there. Knight took and queen took. Practically, white is playing with an extra rook and bishop. Here the deep blue retreated the queen to d7, but other moves, for example trading queens, are not any better. Let's just see a variation. Then bishop takes back, and now the plan would be to play c6 in the near future. For example, rook e8. Now white could play c6 right away, or play rook b2 first, and then when rook c8, then play c6, rook c6, rook c6, pawn takes b7, and the rook is trapped. What a nice line. Going back to the game after queen d4, black continued right now with queen d7, and now the problem is that white relocates the dark squared bishop to the weak dark squares on the king side. So the first step in that direction is bishop d2. The rook is running because the bishop is coming to g5 next. Rook c8, trying to hold off the c6 square, but the trouble comes anyway. Bishop f6, king h7, and this is a key moment where Kasparov had to find the right move, although I have a feeling that g4 would also be sufficient to win, but c6 is the simplest without allowing any counterplay whatsoever. Deep blue captured with a pawn. If the rook would capture, white's plan was to double up the rooks, and then if rook takes, queen e8, followed by queen c5, and black's position is completely hopeless after the white queen appears on the 8th rank. Let's go back and look at the position. After the pawn sacrifice with c6, what happens when black captures with the pawn? And white played queen c5. Black has hard time finding a move. Came king h6, rook b2, threatening to advance the pawn and fork, queen b7, and now white played a simple quiet move, practically putting black in Zugzwang. And here the deep blue team resigned for the machine. The question is, why did black resign? Well, the reality is that black, as I said, has hardly any moves. The rook on a8 cannot move. The bishop on b8 cannot move. If the rook moves from c8, then the pawn on c6 falls. And finally, if the black queen moves, then the white pawn advances to b7, forking the two black rooks. So the only move left is to move the king back to h7. But even then, white wins pretty easily after forcing the exchange of the queens, which is important because the queen was the piece that was holding off white's passed pawn on the b file. Black doesn't have a choice but to trade. Bishop takes back, rook runs away from the fork, and now b7 anyway, rook a7, and bishop c5 traps the rook. And for example, rook d8 just takes the pawn, and then on the next move, pretty much regardless what black plays, white would just play rook c8. And we can see that black's position is completely hopeless. Let's go back a few moves to the position even further back when the computer resigned after rook b4. The other option was to give up on the pawn, but that's not any better either, because after queen c6, again, black cannot avoid the exchange of the queens, and after that, the b pawn will be super powerful. For example, king h7, b7, rook a7. A tricky moment where white cannot play rook c8, the obvious move, because of rook b7. In this position, white could play rook c8, but then black would get a little bit of counter chance with rook b7. There is no reason to allow that, because white has plenty of time to play rook c8 in an ideal moment, and to achieve that is to play rook b6 to avoid the rook hanging on b4 after a potential rook c8 and rook b7 sacrifice. So now rook c8 is a very serious threat. Rook g8 and rook c8. Black is running out of moves. d4, and now white could just play king f1 or go for a checkmate, even better, rook b to c6, and for example, after d3, takes, check, followed by checkmate in the corner, or alternatively, if black does not push the pawn right now, but tries to escape with the king, then again, take, and of course the bishop is already lost on b8, and black's position is over. What an impressive game by Kasparov, how just totally outclassed Deep Blue of 1996. This is definitely a game that shows the 20% or whatever percent of chess positions that the computer doesn't understand, or at least at the time didn't understand. On a human level, it's also important to understand that passivity can lead to such situations when your own pieces take room and breathing space and moves away from each other, and that's certainly something to avoid. And now, finally, let's see the jewel of the week. And this position is from the book of Stama, back from the early 18th century, long time ago. Well, in this position, black seems to have the clear advantage, at least materially speaking, having still a queen for white's extra rook. Nevertheless, because of the open position of black's king, white can force checkmate in just 4 moves. Try to figure out what is the correct sequence. Well, in this case, actually, you had an easy time, because there are 2 correct solutions, so hopefully you figured one out at least. It doesn't matter in particular which rook white starts giving the check with, either one works. If the king moves to the h-file, obviously the checkmate follows, so the king needs to run the other way. And now comes the beautiful, elegant part that involves 2 sacrifices in order to force the checkmate. You see it? Oh yes, knight d7. Beautiful. Forces the rook to d7, which will be crucial, so the black king will have no escape route towards the queen side. And now, of course, we need to sacrifice the correct rook, which is the e-rook, and then back rank checkmate with rook g8. Very elegant and pretty amazing that people came up with these ingenious ideas already back almost 300 years ago. That's pretty impressive. Well, I hope you enjoyed this game, this important historic game that shows the difference between human chess and computer chess, and what happens when the human succeeds in getting in a type of position that the computer doesn't understand. Well, hope you enjoyed this lesson, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.